The river in the questions. Night settles differently along a river. Beyond the cultivated ground, the desert releases the heat it stored through the day. The sky darkens over cliffs and floodplain, over villages whose modern lights occupy places where other homes once stood, and over cemeteries that have watched the Nile alter its course. Ancient Egypt is often introduced through objects that seem motionless. A stone face, a sealed coffin, a pyramid fixed against the horizon. But the civilization behind those objects was never still. It changed across more than 3,000 years of dynastic history, and its deeper beginnings reach farther back. Languages shifted. Capitals rose and declined. Ancient rulers. Gods gained prominence or receded. Burial practices available to a king in one century could inspire a courtier in another and, much later, a family of modest means. That long duration is the first real mystery. How can anyone speak of the Egyptians as though people living under the first dynasties and people living under the first dynasties and people living under Cleopatra shared one unchanging world? They did inherit names, images, ceremonies, and ideas. They also revised them. A temple might preserve an ancient style while its priests served a recent political order. A scribe could copy a classical form of the language that was no longer the speech heard in a market. Continuity was not the absence of change. It was often change managed through the authority of the past. Our evidence is uneven. Stone survives where wood, reed, cloth, food, and unbaked mud disappear. Desert cemeteries preserve what the damp floodplain destroys. Elite tombs announce the hopes of their owners more loudly than poor houses record the lives of their occupants. Royal inscriptions present what a ruler wished to be remembered, not an impartial chronicle. Even a beautifully painted agricultural scene is not a photograph of one ordinary afternoon. It is an ordered image of abundance, labor, and permanence, made for a tomb. The careful historian listens to it, but does not allow it to speak alone. The Nile itself encouraged both movement and concentration. Its waters linked communities along a narrow corridor. Prevailing winds could carry sailing boats south while the current assisted travel north. The annual flood, before modern dams transformed the river's rhythm, renewed fields, but varied enough to bring anxiety. Too little water could mean hunger. Too much could damage settlements and boundaries. Egyptians measured, taxed, petitioned, stored, and redistributed. Their society was not created by a river acting as a magician. It was created by people learning, sometimes cooperatively and sometimes coercively, to organize life around water, land, and labor. Before kings had dynasties, thousands of years before Khufu's pyramid, communities farmed, herded, fished, traded, buried their dead, and made objects of striking skill. Predynastic pottery carries boats, animals, standards, and human figures whose exact meanings remain debated. Stone vessels traveled far from the quarries that supplied them. Materials such as obsidian, shells, and ivory reveal contacts beyond a single valley. Differences among graves show that inequality was developing before the state left us long lists of kings. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, political power became increasingly concentrated. Images show rulers striking enemies, controlling animals, or presiding over ordered rows. These are statements of authority, not transparent news reports. The Nama palette is frequently treated as a snapshot of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. It may relate to conflict and kingship at that formative moment, but its ceremonial imagery compresses politics into symbols. Unification was probably a process rather than one clean event on one day. Archaeology reveals regional centers, competition, exchange, and expanding administration. The palette tells us that rule over a joined land mattered as an idea. It cannot by itself narrate every step by which that rule was achieved. Writing appeared within this world of institutions. Early labels and inscriptions often concern names, places, commodities, and authority. Writing did not begin as a complete book of philosophy. It developed through practical and ceremonial uses, and for centuries, literacy remained specialized. The familiar hieroglyphs were only one form. Monumental signs could be carved with care, while cursive scripts allowed faster work on papyrus, pottery flakes, wood, and other surfaces. To call hieroglyphs mere picture writing is misleading. A sign could represent a thing, a sound, or help classify the meaning of a word. Readers used context, language, and conventions, not a simple reader's guess from drawings. When the script finally fell out of use, knowledge of it faded. Later viewers still stood before the monuments, but could no longer recover their sentences. In 1799, soldiers in the French expedition found a broken stela near Rashid, called Rosetta in European accounts. Its decree of 196 BCE appeared in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek scripts. It was not a secret handbook. It was a political and priestly decree honoring Ptolemy V. Its importance lay in comparison. Thomas Young made significant advances, and Jean-François Champollion, drawing also on Coptic, demonstrated the phonetic dimension of the Egyptian system. Decipherment was not a single lucky glance. It required years of arguments, comparisons, corrections, and the recognition that the signs could write Egyptian sounds, including in native names. The first pyramid did not arrive in Egypt as an isolated miracle. Elite burials had long been marked by rectangular superstructures now called mastabas. At Saqqara, the complex of King Djoser transformed and stacked architectural forms in stone. The step pyramid rose through design changes, surrounded by courts and buildings connected with kingship and renewal. The name of Imhotep, an official later celebrated far beyond his lifetime, became associated with the project. Calling him a lone inventor, however, hides the surveyors, quarry workers, haulers, masons, craftspeople, administrators, and food producers whose coordinated work made monumental building possible. During Sneferu's reign, pyramid construction passed through visible experiments. The Pyramid of Meidum, the bent pyramid at Darsha, and the Red Pyramid show changes in form and angle. Scholars debate parts of their building histories, yet the broad sequence matters. Egyptian engineers learned through projects, alterations, and accumulated practice. The bent pyramid's change of angle is not a coded message from a vanished technology. It is physical evidence that enormous building plans met material problems and were adjusted. At Giza, the pyramids of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure belong to larger complexes with temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, cemeteries, harbors, and work areas. The Great Pyramid's precision is extraordinary. Extraordinary does not mean inexplicable. Extraordinary does not mean inexplicable. Limestone was quarried close to the plateau. Finer casing stone came from Tara, and granite used in major elements came from immense canes, copper tools, stone pounders, sledges, ropes, levers, ramps in some combination. Careful leveling and disciplined measurement all belong to an Egyptian technical tradition. The precise arrangements of ramps remained debated because temporary construction infrastructure was dismantled, reused, or left incomplete in the record. Debate over the shape of ramps does not doubt that human beings built the monument. One modest-looking archive has brought those human beings closer. Papyri found at Wadi el-Jarf include the logbook associated with an official named Mera. It records a crew transporting limestone by boat in connection with Akhet Khufu, the name of Khufu's pyramid complex. The document does not explain every stage of construction, but it anchors the project in administration, waterways, named teams, and counted days. At Giza, excavated settlements, bakeries, animal bones, tools, seals, and crew graffiti add other scales of evidence. Workers were organized and provisioned. Some were specialists. Others may have served rotating labor obligations. Their conditions cannot be romanticized as modern employment, yet the popular picture of vast chains of enslaved foreigners is unsupported. The claim that aliens built the pyramids does more than offer an unnecessary answer. It erases evidence of Egyptian achievement. It asks us to discard the development from earlier tombs, the quarries and tool marks, the settlements and accounts, the changing designs and the cultural setting of royal burial. No alien object, text, material, or technology has been found in a pyramid context. The mystery worth keeping is human. How leadership, belief, taxation, seasonal labor, skilled knowledge, and ambition were assembled on such a scale. Inside the Great Pyramid, passages and chambers have inspired endless diagrams. Non-invasive muon imaging reported a large void above the Grand Gallery. Void describes a detected region of low density, not a room whose purpose is known. It may relate to construction, weight relief, or an architectural space not yet understood. Responsible investigation begins at that limit. A scan can reveal contrast without supplying a treasure, a doorway, or a story. The unknown remains real without being made supernatural. The Sphinx at the edge of certainty. The Great Sphinx combines a lion's body with a royal human head and sits within the 4th dynasty landscape at Giza, commonly associated with Khafre's complex. Quarry relationships, architectural setting, and stylistic arguments support that context. Some details remain disputed, including the exact sequence of cutting and the full history of weathering and repair. The monument has spent long periods partly buried, then exposed, restored, damaged, and reinterpreted. Claims that erosion proves the Sphinx was made many thousands of years before dynastic Egypt have not displaced the archaeological case for its Old Kingdom setting. Geological discussion can be technically complex. Rain, groundwater, salt, wind, sand, stone quality, and restoration all affect surfaces. Choosing one weathering feature, assigning it one cause, and then leaping to a lost Ice Age civilization is not a sound chain of proof. Nor did Napoleon's artillery shoot off the nose. Images made before his campaign already show it missing. Medieval testimony has been connected with deliberate damage, though the exact episode should still be described with caution. Between its paws stands the dream stela of Thutmose IV. It tells how the young prince rested near the buried monument and was promised kingship if he cleared the sand. That inscription was created after the Sphinx itself and served a royal purpose. It offers evidence for New Kingdom attention to an ancient sacred image, not a contemporary account of the Sphinx's first construction. Egyptian monuments accumulated biographies. A later king could restore, rename, claim, or converse ritually with a work already ancient in his own time. Tombs, bodies, and manufactured curses, Egyptian preservation of the dead changed greatly. Early desert burials could dry bodies naturally. Later specialists developed elaborate evisceration, treatment with natron, wrapping, anointing, and enclosure in coffins. Not every person received the same procedure, and methods varied by period, wealth, place, and circumstance. The heart was often left because it mattered to identity and judgment. The brain could be removed in some elite procedures, but the casual statement that Egyptians thought it worthless exceeds the evidence. Ritual texts, material preservation, and practical craft were interwoven. Modern imaging allows researchers to examine wrapped bodies with less disturbance. CT scans can show skeletal injury, dental disease, amulets, packing materials, and aspects of embalming. They do not make interpretation automatic. Damage may have occurred before death, during embalming, through ancient robbery, under early modern handling, or as tissue dried. A scan is evidence filtered through preservation and clinical judgment. The so-called mummy's curse belongs largely to modern media. After Howard Carter's team entered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the death of Lord Carnarvon became material for sensational stories. People connected with the discovery did not fall in a rapid, coherent supernatural pattern. Many lived for years. Tombs can contain mold, dust, or other hazards. But a biological risk is not an ancient spell selecting victims. Ancient tomb warnings, where they occur, defend sacred property in their own religious and legal world. They are not proof that newspaper prophecy came true. Tutankhamun's burial was unusually intact compared with most royal tombs, not untouched. Ancient intrusions probably occurred, followed by resealing. The crowded arrangement suggests a burial assembled under pressure after the young king's death. His mummy and genetic studies have prompted diagnoses and family reconstructions, but confident murder plots outrun the evidence. Malaria, infection, and physical conditions have been reported. The contribution of each to his death remains uncertain. A dramatic blow to the head is not established as his cause of death. Here the honest answer is less cinematic. A young ruler died. His body endured severe post-mortem change, and medicine cannot recover a complete clinical chart from it. Many ways to be divine. Egyptian religion had no single creed recited unchanged by everyone. Temples developed local theologies. Gods could merge in names and attributes without becoming permanently identical. Creation could be described through different centers and divine families. These accounts did not always compete in the modern sense. A world rich in analogy could sustain several sacred explanations. Temple reliefs show the king presenting offerings to gods, even when priests performed daily acts in practice. At the center, a cult image was awakened, clothed, purified, fed symbolically, and protected. Ordinary people did not stroll freely into every chamber. They approached divinity through festivals, processions, household objects, prayers, letters to the dead, healing practices, and local shrines. Religion lived at different social distances. Magic is a convenient English word, but can mislead if it implies fraud or a practice opposed to religion. The Egyptian concept often rendered as Hika referred to an effective sacred power woven into creation. Spoken words, written signs, gestures, and substances could act together. Protective amulets were not decorative superstition placed beside a supposedly rational medicine. Medical papyri combine observation, recipes, incantation, and diagnosis, because Egyptian categories were not ours. Afterlife texts also changed. The pyramid texts, first known from late Old Kingdom royal pyramids, were carved collections of utterances, not a single uniform book. Related traditions later appeared in coffin texts used beyond kingship, though access still depended on status and resources. What we call the Book of the Dead is another modern label for selections of spells placed on papyri and other objects. Copies differ. There was no one standardized volume hidden in every tomb. The famous judgment scene, with the heart weighed against the feather of mate, expresses moral and cosmic order. That meant more than courtroom truth. It embraced rightness, balance, and the proper conditions sustained against disorder. Tomb provisioning, names, images, and ritual sought continued existence, but Egyptian hopes were diverse, joining the sun's cycle, moving with Osiris, entering fertile fields, receiving offerings, and remaining socially remembered. Lives beside the monuments. Most Egyptians never saw the inside of a royal burial chamber. They cultivated grain, maintained canals, tended animals, brewed beer, baked bread, spun linen, shaped pottery, traded, carried, counted, and raised families. Their work supported the state, temples, estates, and households. Taxation could be collected in produce and labor. A good harvest did not erase inequality. A failed flood could sharpen it. Women could own and inherit property, make contracts, initiate divorce, and appear in legal records. These capacities were significant, especially when compared across some ancient systems, but they did not create modern equality. Most high offices were held by men. Wealth and family position shaped every formal right. Household affection appears in letters and images alongside conflict, abandonment, and lawsuits. Literacy belonged to a minority. Scribes trained through copying and correction, and the title scribe covered varied offices. Surviving exercises praised the scribal career while mocking exhausting trades, a reminder that school texts promote a professional identity. Ostraca, flakes of limestone or pottery used as writing surfaces, preserve calculations, sketches, attendance notes. Letters, literaries, because they were inexpensive, they often bring us nearer to working life than monumental stone. At Deir el-Medina, the community of artisans who cut and decorated New Kingdom royal tombs left an exceptional textual record. We learn of rations, absences, illness, family arguments, property, accusations, and religious devotion. In the reign of Ramesses III, workers stopped work when grain rations were delayed, an event often called the first recorded labor strike. The label is modern, but the protest is documented. The men sat down and carried their complaint through official channels. Monument makers were not anonymous machines. They understood obligations and could insist that the state fulfill them. Queens, erasures, and political memory. Hatshepsut ruled as king during the 18th dynasty, using royal titles and visual forms that could include a masculine body and ceremonial beard. This was not a disguise maintained because nobody knew she was a woman. Inscriptions identify her, and her representation negotiated in office conventionally male. Her monuments proclaim divine legitimacy, successful building, and the expedition to Punt. Punt's exact location remains debated, with evidence pointing toward the Red Sea region and northeast Africa. Reliefs show valued goods and exotic abundance through the glamour of royal display. Years after Hatshepsut's death, some of her names and images were removed or altered. The timing and pattern complicate the familiar tale that Tutmosis III immediately attacked the memory of a hated stepmother. He had ruled beside her and later reigned successfully. Scholars have proposed dynastic succession, ritual, and political reasons for the campaign against her memory. Personal resentment may be imaginable, but imagination is not an inscription. Erasure itself was selective and historically situated. Akhenaten created another altered memory. He elevated the Aten, founded the city now called Amarna, changed artistic conventions, and restricted traditional cults, especially that of Amun. Calling him the first monotheist compresses a strange Egyptian episode into a later category. Other divine names and practices did not vanish uniformly, and household archaeology at Amarna shows protective figures beyond official art and imagery. Atenism centered the royal family as mediator. It was revolutionary in important ways without being a simple ancestor of every later one-god faith. After Akhenaten, the court restored neglected cults and abandoned the new capital. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. Later king lists and monuments minimized the Amarna rulers, yet suppression was incomplete. Blocks were reused as fill. Objects remained underground. Archaeology recovered what official memory tried to reorder. Destruction can paradoxically preserve when fragments are sealed inside later construction. War stories and peace. Ramesses II covered Egypt with images and names, sometimes incorporating earlier monuments into his program. His battle narratives at Kadesh portray heroic isolation. The king faces danger and saves the army through personal courage and divine favor. Hittite records and the political aftermath give a less solitary picture. Kadesh was not the clean triumph. The reliefs invite a temple visitor to see. Royal inscriptions were performances of kingship. Years later, Egypt and Hatti concluded a peace treaty. Versions survive in Egyptian and Akkadian. Their existence lets us compare diplomatic formulations across courts, though even treaties express official interests. The agreement addressed peace, mutual assistance, and fugitives. Ramses later married a Hittite princess. The same reign could monumentalize combat and practice negotiation. Propaganda is not the opposite of history. It is evidence for what power wanted an audience to accept. Egypt and the wider world. Ancient Egypt was never sealed from Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean. Gold, timber, incense, copper, wine, livestock, crafted objects, and human beings crossed its borders. Nubian societies to the south were trading partners, rivals, subjects of conquest, and at times rulers of Egypt. Egyptian sources often depict foreigners through ordered stereotypes. Those images reveal ideology, not a census of human appearance or a complete account of relations. During the 25th dynasty, Kushite kings ruled Egypt and presented themselves through Egyptian royal traditions, while maintaining connections to Nubian centers. Their reigns are not an embarrassing interruption in a pure national line. They belong to Egypt's history and Northeast Africa's entangled political world. Later, Assyrian, Persian, Macedonian, and Roman power changed the state again. Foreign origin did not prevent rulers from using Egyptian temples, titles, and ceremonies. Cleopatra VII belonged to the Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty and was the last active ruler of its kingdom. She engaged deeply with Egyptian kingship and, unlike many predecessors in her house, was reported to speak Egyptian among several languages. Modern demands for one certain reconstruction of her appearance outrun the evidence, especially because her maternal ancestry is not securely known. Coins and sculpture are political portraits shaped by medium and message. Roman authors wrote about Cleopatra within a world formed by Octavian's victory over her and Mark Antony. Their accounts must be read for information and for rhetoric. The popular seductress who defeats men only through beauty is a reduction of a multilingual monarch navigating dynastic instability and Roman expansion. Her tomb has not been securely found. A promising excavation or attractive theory remains a lead, not a discovery, until context, inscriptions, and material evidence converge. Alexandria's ancient shoreline has changed through subsidence, earthquakes, construction, and sea level processes. Underwater archaeology has documented architectural remains and objects. This is fascinating without becoming Atlantis. Plato's Atlantis was a philosophical story situated far beyond Egypt in a different literary argument. A submerged harbor proves that coasts change, not that every lost city legend is factual. What the silence means, archaeology does not steadily replace mystery with certainty. It often replaces one simple story with several more precise questions. A chemical residue can identify ingredients, but not recover every recipe. A skeleton can suggest stress or disease, but rarely a person's private thoughts. A name scratched by a work crew can refute anonymity while leaving individual lives mostly dark. Precision includes knowing what a method cannot do. Modern excavation also has a history of unequal power. European empires, collectors, dealers, and scholars removed vast numbers of Egyptian objects. Early excavators sometimes recorded carefully by the standards of their day. Others destroyed context in pursuit of display pieces. Egyptian archaeologists and conservators have always been central to the work, even when older publications minimized them. Current debates over ownership, excavation permits, museum ethics, and repatriation are not distractions from ancient history. They shape which objects are studied, where they are seen, and whose authority defines their meaning. The Rosetta Stone itself embodies both decipherment and imperial transfer. After the French surrender in Egypt, it passed into British possession and entered the British Museum. Egypt has repeatedly sought the return of major antiquities held abroad. One can acknowledge the scholarly importance of global collections while also examining the conditions under which collections formed. An object's modern biography does not end when it enters a glass case. Responsible wonder is slower than sensational certainty. It asks how a claim is known. It distinguishes a royal boast from an administrative note, a later restoration from original construction, a scan anomaly from an entered chamber, and a diagnosis from a possibility. It allows scholars to disagree without pretending that every disagreement has equal support. The pyramids need no vanished super-civilization to be astonishing. Their human context makes them more, not less, remarkable. Mummification needs no curse to reveal a profound concern with identity and survival. Hieroglyphs need no secret code beyond the demanding achievement of reading an ancient language. Cleopatra needs no invented tomb announcement to remain a formidable historical figure. The gaps in our knowledge are not failures to decorate with fantasy. They are invitations to keep measuring, translating, excavating, conserving, comparing and revising. Near dawn, stone on the plateau begins to take color before the valley below is fully awake. The monuments appear eternal only because human lifetimes are short. They have been quarried, robbed, repaired, buried, exposed, worshipped, feared, studied, sold, and protected. Each age has made an Egypt suited to its dreams. The discipline of history asks for something gentler and harder, to let surviving people and objects resist those dreams. There will always be mysteries here. Some may yield to a papyrus recovered from a sealed deposit, a newly read inscription, a careful excavation, or an instrument capable of seeing without cutting. Others may remain unanswered because the evidence is gone. An honest, unanswered question is not empty. It marks the edge between the ancient world and our desire to possess it. At that edge, certainty grows quiet, and attention begins. Counting the year to live beside the Nile was to watch time arrive in several forms. The river had its season, fields had theirs, and temples observed calendars of festivals and offerings. Administrators needed dates for taxes, deliveries, work assignments, and royal anniversaries. Egyptian civil reckoning used 12 months of 30 days, followed by 5 additional days. The elegant total of 365 did not include the extra fraction of the solar year requires. Without a leap year correction in most of pharaonic history, the civil calendar slowly moved through the natural seasons. That drift is valuable to modern chronology, although matching ancient dates with our calendar can be difficult. The year was commonly described in 3 seasons: inundation, emergence, and harvest. These names expressed an agricultural rhythm, not a guarantee that every district flooded or ripened at the same moment. Basin irrigation, soil, local height, labor, and variations in the flood all mattered. Agricultural scenes show plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing, and measuring. They make the system look harmonious because Tumart was designed to secure abundance. Administrative documents add complaints, shortages, arrears, and calculations. Together the sources recover a world that was neither effortless bounty nor unbroken disaster. The heliacal rising of Sirius, its first visible appearance before dawn after a period of invisibility, was associated with seasonal renewal. Modern accounts sometimes turn Egyptian astronomy into knowledge of an impossible precision or a map of hidden cosmic visitors. The authentic achievement is better. Priests and observers tracked stars, divided the night, oriented sacred architecture, and linked celestial cycles with ritual. Star clocks painted on coffins and later astronomical ceilings preserve systems that changed over time. They are technical and religious at once. Pyramid orientation close to the cardinal directions demonstrates careful observation and surveying. The exact procedure used at Giza is not written in a surviving instruction manual. Proposals involve circumpolar stars, shadows, sighting instruments, or combinations of methods. Experiments can show that a method is plausible. They cannot prove that builders used it unless evidence connects the experiment to ancient practice. This distinction is easy to lose. Reproducing a result answers could, not automatically, did. Egyptians measured time at night with stars and later used devices such as water clocks. A surviving water clock associated with the reign of Amenhotep III has interior scales adjusted for unequal seasonal hours. Because an hour could represent 1/12 of daylight or darkness, its duration varied across the year. The modern fixed hour should not be silently projected backward. Time was quantified, but its divisions lived with the sky. Numbers, surveys, and practical knowledge. Mathematical papyri preserve worked problems involving fractions, areas, volumes, distributions, and the slopes of pyramids. They were probably training and reference texts, not abstract treatises in the Greek style. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, copied by a scribe named Ahmose from an older source, declares its concern with accurate reckoning. Its problems show methods. Sometimes there are examples whose purpose still invites discussion. Egyptian numeration was decimal, but not positional like the system used in most modern arithmetic. Signs represented powers of 10 and could be repeated. Fractions were often expressed as sums of unit fractions, with important exceptions. This can look cumbersome to a modern reader accustomed to decimals. Yet a notation should be judged by the tasks its users performed. Scribes distributed bread and beer, measured grain, calculated labor, and maintained accounts across a large administration. The word geometry tempts a familiar story. The Nile erased boundaries each year, forcing Egyptians to invent land surveying. Floods certainly created disputes and made measurement important, but a neat single-origin tale oversimplifies. Surveying served taxation, estates, building, and boundary restoration. Knotted ropes, rods, plumb lines, levels, and sighting procedures translated decisions into space. The title, often rendered rope stretcher, evokes one part of that working practice. Construction tolerances also varied by context. A royal monument could mobilize precise dressing and alignment, while an ordinary mud brick house was repaired as family needs changed. Egyptian builders understood loads and materials through accumulated craft knowledge. They did not need modern equations to be competent, and we should not invent lost machines because their explanations took different forms from ours. Medicine. Without miracles, medical papyri survive unevenly and often as later copies of older material. The Edwin Smith papyrus is famous for cases concerning injuries. It arranges examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment in a manner that can feel strikingly clinical. The Ebers papyrus contains a much wider body of remedies and incantations. It is misleading to choose one as rational Egypt and dismiss the other as magic. Both belong to a culture in which effective words, substances, skilled observation, and divine forces could share a treatment. Some remedies contained ingredients with genuine pharmacological effects. Honey can inhibit some microbial growth. Immobilization can help a fracture. Other ingredients would be useless or harmful by modern standards. Identifying a familiar substance does not license the claim that Egyptians discovered an exact modern drug. Dosage, preparation, diagnosis, contamination, and intended ritual action matter. Ancient medicine deserves neither mockery nor miraculous promotion. Teeth reveal a particularly harsh reality. Grit introduced during grain grinding wore enamel. Abscesses and tooth loss could follow. Mummies also show healed fractures, degenerative disease, vascular calcification in some individuals, and parasitic infection. These remains do not form a representative national health survey. Elite bodies are overrepresented, preservation selects its sample, and diagnostic criteria can change. They do demonstrate that monumental civilization did not protect bodies from chronic pain. Physicians held differentiated titles, though translations such as dentist or specialist must be used carefully. One of the earliest people later celebrated as a physician is Hazi-Ra, whose titles are known from his 3rd dynasty tomb. Calling him the first doctor in world history goes beyond what survival permits. He is among the earliest named practitioners known to us. Earlier healers existed without leaving a name that archaeologists have recovered. Pregnancy and birth were dangerous. Women used household amulets and invoked protective beings such as Turet and Bez. Birth bricks and magical texts connect domestic space, bodily risk, and divine aid. Some papyri give fertility or pregnancy tests involving plants. Modern experiments reported in popular summaries do not turn the whole system into laboratory obstetrics. The texts record practice knowledge within ancient assumptions. Law without a surviving code. No single pharaonic law code comparable to the Code of Hammurabi has survived. It does not follow that Egypt lacked law. Decrees, contracts, trial records, petitions, property transfers, and officials' titles showed legal institutions at work. Mart supplied an ideal of right order, but cases were decided by people embedded in hierarchy and local relationships. Local councils often translated as Kenbet heard disputes. Oracles could also answer questions, particularly in later periods, by interpreting the movement of a divine image carried in procession. To a modern court, this is not evidence. Within the Egyptian setting, it could be an authorized mode of decision. Legal practice changed across centuries, and royal intervention remained possible. Documents from Deir el-Medina offer unusually close views of conflict. Neighbors disputed property, families arranged inheritance, workers accused one another of theft, and testimony could be challenged. The tomb robbery papyri from the late New Kingdom record investigations into violated royal and private burials. Confessions appear, but coercive beating was part of interrogation. A transcript is therefore not a transparent window into guilt. Contradictions among records may reveal administrative rivalry as much as criminal fact. The Great Tomb robberies were not simply the work of foreign invaders in an instant of collapse. They involved knowledge, access, markets for precious materials, and sometimes officials. Royal mummies were moved and rewrapped by later priests, eventually placed in caches. Their actions stripped and rearranged some burials while protecting bodies from further destruction. The caches discovered in the 19th century created the misleading impression that many kings had originally been buried together. Archaeological context and inscriptions reconstructed the secondary gathering. Punishments could include beating, mutilation, forced labor, property loss, or death, depending on period and offense. Rank influenced vulnerability. Ancient Egypt's refined art should not soften its coercive state, nor should cruelty be isolated as an exotic trait. The record asks the same questions raised by other early states: who could speak, whose oath counted, who controlled resources, and which violence institutions declared lawful. Bread, beer, and the taste of evidence. Bread and beer were staples and units of payment. Tomb models, scenes, installations, vessels, plant remains, and texts help reconstruct production. Emmer wheat and barley were important, though crops and recipes varied. Dough might contain dates, fats, or flavorings, but the impressive lists sometimes presented online combine evidence from different centuries and social settings, as if one menu lay on every table. Beer was nutritious, social, and ritually valuable. Its strength and texture were not uniform. Experimental archaeology can explore malting and fermentation using ancient installations and residues. The result is a modern reconstruction constrained by evidence, not a resurrected bottle with a guaranteed ancient taste. Yeasts evolve. Vessels, temperature, water, and grain alter a brew. Archaeobotany studies seeds, chaff, pollen, wood, and other plant traces. Zooarchaeology examines animal bone, age, butchery, and distribution. At Giza, these methods have helped researchers ask how a large labor force was fed. Cattle, sheep, goats, fish, grain, and other supplies moved through organized networks. A menu can indicate status. Cuts of meat and access to livestock were not equal. Feeding workers was logistical power made edible. Feasting bound institutions and communities, while hunger appears in skeletal stress and text of hardship. Literary laments describe a world overturned. But they cannot simply be filed as eyewitness accounts of one famine. Genre matters. A text can use chaos as moral and political thought. Environmental evidence and administrative records must be compared before assigning a literary composition to a specific catastrophe. Wine was produced in Egypt and imported. Jar labels could record a state, vintner, place, and regnal year, making them valuable chronological evidence. The abundance of labeled wine vessels in Tutankhamun's burial says much about elite provisioning and record-keeping. It does not mean the king personally drank every jar. A tomb assemblage served ritual and status as well as anticipated use. Mining the desert, sailing the sea. The valley was narrow, but Egyptian activity reached deep into deserts. Expeditions sought stone, copper, gold, pigments, and routes to ports. Inscriptions in quarries and wadis record officials, crews, destinations, and royal authority. Such inscriptions commemorate success. They say less about failed journeys, illness, desertion, or the burdens placed on conscripted workers. Wadi Hammamat connected the Nile with the Red Sea and supplied valued stone. Sinai expeditions sought turquoise and copper. Nubian gold supported state wealth, especially during imperial periods. Mining landscapes preserve huts, processing areas, roads, pottery, and water arrangements. Their remoteness corrects the postcard image of Egypt as only riverbank temples. At Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea, excavations revealed harbor installations, galleries used for storage, anchors, ceramics, and papyri from Khufu's reign. The site demonstrates maritime organization during the Old Kingdom. It does not prove a global oceanic empire. Egyptian seafaring capabilities were real and need no enlargement into voyages for which no reliable evidence exists. Punt appears in texts and images as a source of incense, exotic animals, woods, and other goods. Hatshepsut's reliefs at Deir el-Bahari give the most famous representation, including ships and Puntite houses. The relief is both information and royal celebration. Researchers have placed Punt broadly around the southern Red Sea and Horn of Africa, using geography, commodities, and biological evidence. But its boundaries and political character remain uncertain. Searching for one capital marked Punt may impose a modern state concept on a network or region. Boats used the river as Egypt's principal highway. Hull forms and rigging changed. Some vessels were assembled from planks without the deep keel familiar from later European shipbuilding. The disassembled boat buried near Khufu's pyramid was reconstructed in modern times. Whether it once sailed or served a symbolic funerary role has been debated. Signs of water exposure have entered that discussion. Calling it simply the pharaoh's personal pleasure yacht turns uncertainty into biography. Temples as living institutions. A great temple was not only a building for prayer. It owned fields, employed personnel, received deliveries, managed workshops, and accumulated privileges. Its economic scale varied with time and place. Donations recorded on walls promoted royal generosity, so their figures require critical reading. Temple and crown were intertwined rather than cleanly separate sectors. Monumental pylons and courts controlled movement toward increasingly restricted rooms. Decoration mapped that movement. Exterior scenes might show the king defeating enemies, restoring order at the boundary. Interior walls showed offerings and divine encounters. Relief did not merely illustrate theology. Repeated ritual images helped make acts enduring. At Karnak, centuries of kings added, dismantled, enclosed, usurped, and restored. There is no single original Karnak plan. A gateway could be moved from center to margin by a later court. Blocks from one ruler's monuments could become fill inside another's pylon. Digital reconstruction helps scholars test phases, but every model contains choices. A beautifully rendered animation should not be mistaken for a time machine. Festival processions brought gods beyond inner sanctuaries. During the Opet festival, divine images traveled between Karnak and Luxor in ceremonies tied to kingship and renewal. Routes and practices changed across reigns. Spectators experienced sound, crowds, incense, boats, banners, and glimpses of sacred barks, although much of the central ritual remained controlled by specialists. Priests did not necessarily form one lifelong, celibate class. Many served in rotating groups and had families and other positions. Purity rules involved washing, shaving, clothing, diet, and abstention during service. Later Greek descriptions offer details, but they must not be projected unchanged across all pharaonic centuries. Animal gods and animal lives. Egyptian gods shown with animal heads are not evidence that Egyptians believed ordinary people with animal heads walked the streets. Composite form conveyed powers and associations. A falcon could evoke sky and kingship. A jackal like Akhenaten could belong to desert cemeteries and care of the dead. The visual language was symbolic without being merely decorative. Certain living animals were selected as manifestations of a god, such as the Apis bull associated with Ptah at Memphis. A chosen animal received care, ritual attention, and burial. In later periods, vast numbers of mummified animals were offered at cult centers. Cats, ibises, dogs, crocodiles, fish, and other creatures have been found in enormous deposits. Their production supported breeding, pilgrimage, craft, and temple economies. Imaging shows that not every animal package contains a complete animal. Some hold partial remains, feathers, eggshell, or organic material. A few appear empty. It is tempting to label all such bundles ancient fraud. There may indeed have been deception in a mass market, but symbolic completeness, preservation, supply, and ritual conventions also require study. A package's efficacy may not have depended on modern expectations of anatomical wholeness. The modern claim that Egyptians worshipped cats as household masters reduces a varied history to a joke. Cats appear in homes, hunting scenes, divine imagery, and votive economies. The goddess Bastet changed in representation and character over time. Killing certain sacred animals could provoke outrage in some periods. But no single rule describes every cat across every century. Color, stone, and the false whiteness of ruins. Many monuments now appear as bare stone. Ancient surfaces were often painted. Pigment survives in sheltered relief, tombs, and fragments, letting conservators study binders and mineral composition. Temples, statues, and coffins could be intensely colored. The modern preference for pale antiquity is partly an effect of weathering, cleaning, collecting, and later taste. Color terms carried associations that shifted with context. Black could refer to fertile soil, regeneration, or the preserved flesh of Osiris. Green to growth and renewal. Gold to divine flesh and imperishability. These meanings were not a rigid code applied mechanically. Artists made choices within workshops, periods, material constraints, and ritual purposes. Egyptian artists used grids and conventions to organize human figures. Size indicated status more often than optical distance. A tomb owner could tower over laborers. A king could dominate enemies. Composite views showed shoulders frontally, while legs and head appeared in profile. This was not inability to observe nature. Detailed animals and plants demonstrate acute observation. The system selected the most characteristic views for ordered representation. The Amarna period altered proportions and poses, sometimes showing the royal family with elongated heads, narrow chests, full bellies, and intimate gestures. Diagnosing Akhenaten with a particular syndrome from stylized images is hazardous. No securely identified mummy has provided universal agreement, and royal art was ideological. The bodies may express fertility, divinity, family, or new aesthetics rather than clinical anatomy. Statues also had lives. Rituals could activate them as receptacles of presence. Names and inscriptions made identity durable. Removing a nose or damaging eyes might hinder a figure's agency. Although accidental breakage and later reuse must be considered before assigning ritual intent. Museum fragments isolate works that once stood within architectural and ceremonial settings. The Valley of the Kings is a changing place. New kingdom rulers shifted royal burial into the cliffs west of Thebes, while mortuary temples stood nearer cultivation. The valley offered controllable terrain and stone suitable for cut tombs, but concealment was never perfect. Tomb construction required large teams and generated knowledge that could later aid robbery. The numbering system used today, with labels beginning KV, is modern and does not express ancient sequence or ownership perfectly. Tombs were discovered, lost, cleared, reassigned, and renumbered through the history of exploration. Theban mapping project plans make clear that a tunnel can be a corridor, shaft, side chamber, unfinished cutting, or later intrusion. Popular reports often flatten these distinctions into secret passage. Decoration presented a royal journey through night. Compositions now called the Amduat, Book of Gates, and other names map solar and underworld transformations. They were not travel guides in a geographic sense. Text and image performed knowledge that enabled passage, identification, and renewal. Work proceeded by teams who cut, plastered, drew, corrected, carved, and painted. Red preliminary lines and black corrections survive in some places. Mistakes, changes, and unfinished areas reveal process. The flawless appearance of a published plate can hide a thumbprint, a shifted grid, or a decision made because a king died sooner than expected. Royal tombs were often repurposed. Later burials entered older spaces. Floods moved debris. Bats, tourists, antiquarians, and excavators altered environments. When DNA or chemical sampling is proposed, conservation competes with the desire for new information. A test consumes material, even if very little. Science will solve it, ignores decisions about contamination, permissions, statistical power, and the value of leaving something for better future methods. Discovering Tutankhamun, one day at a time. Howard Carter's excavation is unusually well documented through notes, photographs, drawings, cards, and objects now accessible through the Griffith Institute archive. The familiar story of one glittering glance condenses years of survey, patronage, labor, and recording. Egyptian workers who located, carried, conserved, and guarded material rarely received equal space in early publicity. The tomb contained nested shrines, coffins, chests, furniture, vehicles, clothing, food, weapons, games, cosmetics, and ritual equipment. Its fame can distort scale. The burial chamber itself is not an immense hall. Wealth came from density, preservation, and the extraordinary survival of royal assemblage. Carter's team faced conservation problems immediately. Resins had fused coffins, delicate textiles crumbled, organic objects changed after exposure. Methods acceptable in the 1920s may trouble conservators today, while many of Carter's records remain invaluable. Historical judgment should hold both facts. Archaeology improves partly by recognizing damage in its own traditions. Political conflict surrounded the excavation. Egypt had formally gained a degree of independence in 1922, yet British power remained strong. Disputes over access, press rights, division of finds, and authority were bound to nationalism and colonial control. Tutankhamun's objects ultimately remained in Egypt, unlike many earlier divided finds. The treasure's modern history is also a history of sovereignty. The Boy King became a global commercial image. Art Deco design borrowed Egyptian motifs. Advertisements and films multiplied exotic fantasies. Tutmania preserved public interest while severing objects from context. A golden mask could become a logo detached from funerary theology, labor, and the contested conditions of discovery. Reconstructing faces. Reconstructing desire. Forensic artists can build a face over a skull using tissue depth estimates and anatomical markers. The result is a reasoned visualization, not a recovered portrait. Soft tissue, body weight, ears, lips, hairstyle, expression, and skin appearance require choices. Two teams can produce different faces from the same data without either committing fraud. Ancient portraits add another layer. A royal statue can resemble an individual and still embody an ideal, dynasty, office, or god. Workshop conventions and political programs matter. Comparing a mummy to a statue is therefore not a simple identity test. Race labels developed in modern societies do not map neatly onto ancient Egyptian categories. Egypt stood in Africa and interacted continuously with Nubia, Libya, the Levant, Mediterranean communities, and farther networks. Population history involved regional continuity and movement. Genetic studies face preservation, sampling, and representativeness problems. A handful of mummies from one site and period cannot define millions of people across millennia. Ancient texts did distinguish lands and peoples, often through language, allegiance, geography, and stereotyped appearance. Egyptian identity could also be cultural and political. Foreign-born soldiers, administrators, queens, and kings entered Egyptian institutions. The demand to make the civilization exclusively belong to one modern racial box says more about recent arguments than ancient life. How archaeologists know where they are context is an object's set of relationships, layer, position, neighboring material, architecture, and sequence. A scarab purchased without find spot may be beautiful and readable, but much of its history is lost. Looting destroys these relationships even when the object survives intact. This is why a plain potsherd excavated carefully can answer more than an ornate piece stripped of origin. Stratigraphy follows the basic observation that later deposits often lie above earlier ones, while pits, foundations, burrows, floods, and reuse complicate the order. Pottery typology helps compare layers. Radiocarbon dating measures decay in once living material and produces probability ranges, not a year stamped by nature. Calibration and contamination matter. Regnal dates from king lists and astronomical observations offer other frameworks, each with uncertainties. Egyptian chronology is strong in broad outline, but not immovable in every early year. Dynasties can overlap regionally during fragmented periods. Some kings are known poorly. Lengths of reign may be damaged in lists. Scholars speak of high and low chronologies where evidence allows ranges. A documentary narrator should resist turning every approximate date into false precision. Remote sensing includes satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistance, thermal work, and muography. Each responds to different physical properties. An anomaly means the signal differs from its surroundings. It does not tell us by itself whether the cause is a wall, ditch, moisture, geology, modern pipe, or treasure chamber. Excavation, or multiple converging methods, may be needed. The desert continues to yield sites partly because wind exposes and buries, development prompts rescue work, and researchers ask new questions of old maps. Meanwhile, settlements beneath modern towns remain difficult to excavate. The record's apparent emphasis on death is partly a preservation bias. Ancient Egyptians built their houses for living, not for a museum 5,000 years later. The last temples and the persistence of Egypt. The conquest of Alexandria in 332 BCE did not end Egyptian culture. Ptolemaic rulers supported temples, appeared in Egyptian royal form, and worked through priestly institutions while Greek held major administrative roles. Temples such as Edfu and Deir preserve extensive inscriptions from this later age. Their relatively complete walls sometimes tempt writers to project every detail backward to the pyramid builders. A Ptolemaic ritual can preserve old elements and still belong to its own historical setting. After Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, emperors continued to appear as pharaohs on temple walls. Political reality and ritual image diverged. Grain shipments tied Egypt to Rome. Taxes, armies, and local elites reorganized power. Egyptian, Greek, and later Latin documentary worlds overlapped. The Egyptian language continued through Demotic and Coptic stages. Coptic used an alphabet based largely on Greek letters with additional signs and became central to Egyptian Christianity. It was Champollion's knowledge of Coptic that helped him understand the language behind hieroglyphic writing. Ancient Egyptian did not simply vanish when the last monumental sign was carved. The temple at Philae preserves one of the latest securely dated hieroglyphic inscriptions, made in the late 4th century CE. A Demotic graffito there is later still. These last texts mark the decline of a writing tradition, not the instantaneous death of a people. Communities converted, languages changed, temples closed or were adapted, and memories persisted in new forms. Byzantine and Islamic Egypt lie outside what popular media calls ancient Egypt, yet no clean wall separates inhabitants from their ancestors. Farmers remained beside the river. Quarries, roads, towns, and sacred places were reused. Medieval visitors wrote on monuments. Local stories gave ancient structures new identities. Egypt after the pharaohs was not merely a waiting room for European rediscovery. A chamber still closed. Imagine, finally, an unentered space detected behind stone. Before anyone looks inside, it attracts predictions: a queen, a library, gold, alien machinery, proof that every textbook is false. The predictions reveal a modern market for revelation. Archaeology begins with less glamour. Is the signal repeatable? Could the space be structural? Can it be reached without destabilizing a monument? Who has authority to decide? How will air, humidity, microorganisms, and human entry affect preservation? When a door opens, the first duty is not to satisfy suspense. It is to keep relationships intact. Dust has a position. A fallen fiber has a position. Ceilings, footprints, insects, and tool marks can be evidence. Rapid entry for a camera may destroy what a patient plan could record. The ethics of discovery is partly an ethics of pace. Some spaces should perhaps remain closed until methods improve. Non-invasive imaging can monitor or refine a hypothesis. Conservation may outweigh curiosity. This restraint can feel unsatisfying only if history is treated as possession. The goal is not to enter every chamber within our lifetime. It is to ham the past forward with fewer losses. Ancient Egypt's deepest lesson may be that survival is always selective. Kings sought eternal names, yet some are nearly erased. Workers expected rations, and a complaint on a broken potsherd outlived palaces. Tomb owners commissioned ideal abundance, while the insects in their grain reveal storage conditions they never meant to record. Monumental certainty and accidental testimony now sit beside each other. In the quiet before sunrise, the unanswered questions do not demand a conspiracy. They ask for attention. Which layer? Which hand? Which reign? Original or reused? Observation or royal metaphor? A likely reading or one proposal among several. Each careful distinction removes a little drama and gives back a little reality. It replaces the fantasy of a mute, magical Egypt with a more intimate mystery of people whose choices can still be traced, though never completely possessed. Names that refuse to disappear. An Egyptian personal name could be a compact sentence: a god is satisfied, a child is healthy, the moon is born, a ruler endures. Names located people within family hopes and sacred language. The name used at home might coexist with titles, nicknames, or a throne name adopted at accession. Modern histories often select one form for convenience, making ancient identity seem tidier than it was. Kings possessed a formal sequence of names and titles. The cartouche enclosed two of the royal names, not every hieroglyphic word connected with a king. Early decipherers correctly suspected that these loops contained royal names because Greek and Roman rulers appeared within them. A cartouche is therefore a useful clue, but spotting one does not translate the surrounding inscription. Changing a name could mark political transformation. Tutankhaten's shift to Tutankhamun announced restoration of Amun after the Amarna period. Names containing a disfavored god might be recut. Conversely, a later ruler could insert his own name into an earlier monument. Egyptologists call this usurpation, though ancient motives range from appropriation to restoration and the desire to reactivate old sacred space. Erasure carried force because name and image helped sustain being. Yet damaged names do not always prove a centrally ordered persecution. Stone was quarried for lime. Christian crosses and figures were cut into older walls. Treasure hunters opened holes and weathered attached surfaces. Damage must be mapped before its motive is narrated. Graffiti complicates the modern divide between vandalism and archive. Ancient visitors wrote prayers, names, sketches, and statements of admiration at already venerable monuments. Workmen marked blocks and spaces unseen by a public audience. Greek, Coptic, Arabic, and European inscriptions later accumulated. A wall became a sequence of encounters. Conservation today normally protects the ancient surface from new carving, while studying historical graffiti is evidence in its own right. Music, games, and evenings at home harps, lutes, lyres, flutes, clappers, sistrums, and drums appear in objects and images from different periods. Music served ritual, procession, work, feasting, mourning, and intimate entertainment. Since Egyptian musical notation has not survived in a form that lets us reproduce complete pharaonic compositions, modern performances are reconstructions. An ancient-looking instrument does not recover an ancient melody by itself. The sistrum's moving bars and rattling pieces had strong associations with goddesses such as Hathor. Its sound belonged to ritual protection and joy. Temple musicians included women with significant titles, though title, performance, and institutional rank varied. A banquet painting showing elegant musicians also presents the tomb owner's desired world, carefully composed for abundance. Board games crossed boundaries between leisure and symbolism. Senate is attested over long periods. Boards and pieces survive, and scenes show play. But the complete rules were not preserved in an ancient manual available to us. Scholars reconstruct possible play from board markings, later texts, and comparison. Commercial sets that advertise the original rules offer a modern rule system, not certainty. During the New Kingdom, Senate acquired strong funerary associations with passage through danger and arrival in a blessed state. The game's meaning therefore changed, or at least expanded. A board placed in a tomb need not prove the deceased used that exact set nightly. Funerary goods could be symbolic, commissioned, inherited, or selected by survivors. Children appear through toys, footprints, burials, letters, and occasional scenes. Dolls or figurines can be difficult to classify because an object may be a toy, ritual item, fertility figure, or more than one of these across its life. Miniature animals with moving jaws show skilled playfulness. But the childhood of poorer families remains lightly documented. Stories were read or recited in settings we cannot fully recover. Tales of shipwreck, eloquent peasants, magical births, quarreling gods, doomed princes, and wandering officials preserved humor and suspense, as well as moral reflection. A literary first-person voice is not automatically autobiography. The tale of Sinuhe uses a life story to explore loyalty, exile, identity, and proper burial. Historians compare its setting with other evidence rather than treating every event as a memoir. Dream books listed dream images and possible outcomes, sometimes labeling them good or bad. Their categories open a window on anxieties involving food, sex, status, danger, and divine favor. They do not demonstrate that dreams predicted the future. They demonstrate that specialists organized uncertainty into interpretable signs. Household evenings would have differed by season and wealth. Oil lamps cost resources. Hearth smoke and insects shared interior air. People repaired nets, twisted fiber, prepared food, told stories, argued, and slept on mats, platforms, or beds. The palace and peasant hut cannot be merged into one cozy scene. Still, small finds make ancient life audible at a human scale. A gaming piece dropped near a wall, a child's footprint in mud brick, a letter asking why someone has not written back. The state-on papyrus Egyptian administration survives in fragments because papyrus preferred dry abandonment to the damp places where most offices once stood. A document found in a desert harbor may endure while thousands produced in Memphis decay. The archive is therefore a selected remainder, not the complete memory of government. Scribes counted grain, cattle, cloth, tools, land, workers, and days. Counting was an exercise of power. A list could determine rations or arrears. A seal controlled access. A title placed its holder in a chain of responsibility. Yet the state was not one smooth machine. Officials competed, local arrangements mattered, and commands could be delayed or ignored. The vizier stood near the summit of administration beneath the king. Text describing the vizier's duties praise impartial hearing, careful record-keeping, and access to petitioners. Such compositions state an ideal. Their very insistence on fairness suggests the problems an office was expected to master: favoritism, false accounting, slow decisions, and abuse. Census of cattle were associated with taxation and regnal dating in early periods. Later documents record fields and harvest estimates. The modern image of bureaucrats measuring everything exactly should be softened by damaged records, negotiated obligations, scribal errors, and local knowledge. A number written down can still be political. Letters give administration a human temperature. Writers complain that supplies have not arrived, insist they already obeyed an order, ask for news, invoke a recipient's health, and sometimes accuse others of neglect. Formulaic greetings do not make the emotion unreal. Convention gave emotion an acceptable form. Because many letters were dictated, the voice on papyrus may combine sender, scribe, and social expectation. Diplomacy beyond the border. The clay tablets found at Amarna preserve international correspondence, mostly written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age. Great kings addressed one another as brothers while negotiating gold, marriages, gifts, and status. Vassal rulers petitioned the Egyptian court, reported threats, and criticized rivals. Their urgency is vivid, but each correspondent promoted his own position. Royal marriage was diplomacy embodied his own position. Origin kings appear reluctant to send their own daughters abroad. This asymmetry advertised rank. Women in these exchanges were political actors, and also instruments of dynastic strategy, though the record rarely preserves their private judgments. Gift exchange between courts was not casual generosity. Quantity, quality, delay, and reciprocity carried meaning. A ruler might complain that promised gold was poor or insufficient. Objects moved with messengers, craftsmen, physicians, and information. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was connected by relationships that could be resilient and fragile at once. Egyptian armies included archers, infantry, chariotry, sailors, scouts, administrators, and foreign troops. Military organization changed from the Old Kingdom through the Imperial New Kingdom and later foreign-ruled periods. The composite bow and horse-drawn chariot became prominent after technologies and animals circulated through Western Asia. Egypt adapted within a connected world rather than inventing every instrument alone. Soldiers could receive land or booty, gain status, suffer wounds, endure long marches, and settle in garrisons. Monumental relief turns battle into ordered victory, with enemies falling beneath the king. Forts, dispatches, weaponware, and soldiers' biographies recover a less choreographed experience. Campaign lists may include real places while arranging them for ritual domination. Fortresses in Nubia controlled movement, trade, and conquered territory during periods of Egyptian expansion. Their architecture supported storage, surveillance, and troops. Semna dispatches record monitoring along the frontier. A border was not a modern line on a map. It was a zone of forts, river passages, communities, exchanges, and force. Captives appear in text and art as labor and victory trophies. Some foreigners rose within Egyptian service, and some communities maintained distinct identities. Neither assimilation nor exclusion offers a universal model. Individual lives crossed categories that royal art preferred to keep orderly. When centralized power weakened near the end of the Bronze Age, older scholarship often blamed mysterious invading sea peoples for a single civilizational collapse. Egyptian inscriptions of Ramesses III describe battles against named groups, but the Eastern Mediterranean disruption involved many pressures: political conflict, changing trade, movement, warfare, and possibly environmental stress. A royal victory scene cannot diagnose an entire international system. Ramesses III's later reign also preserves evidence of economic difficulty and palace conspiracy. Judicial papyri record proceedings against people accused of plotting to kill him. Imaging has identified a severe wound to the royal mummy's throat, strengthening the conclusion that the attack was fatal. Details of sequence and agency remain debated, and the records use legal rhetoric. Here, multiple kinds of evidence converge without supplying every moment. The contrast is instructive. A king shown eternally defeating foreign enemies could be vulnerable inside his own household. Monuments present office. Bodies and court records reveal contingency. Ancient Egypt was most powerful when these voices are read together, neither accepting royal images literally nor dismissing them as useless lies. Cities made of mud-stone temples dominate photographs because stone endures, but most Egyptian buildings rose from mud brick. Floodplain silt mixed with plant material could be molded and dried in the sun. Walls needed repair, roofs required timber and matting, and expanding families altered rooms. A living town continually rebuilt itself, leaving tangled phases rather than the pristine plan. Memphis served as a major political and sacred center for much of Egyptian history, yet its remains are less visually complete than desert monuments. Later occupation, high groundwater, cultivation, and reuse obscured the city. Its relative invisibility should not be mistaken for insignificance. The archaeological map is shaped by preservation as much as ancient importance. At Amarna, rapid foundation and abandonment preserved broad portions of a new kingdom capital. Excavators study palaces, temples, houses, workshops, roads, rubbish, cemeteries, and workmen's settlements. The city was planned in some respects, but grew through individual construction and social negotiation. Grand ceremonial routes coexisted with crowded service spaces. House size at Amarna varied dramatically. Large compounds contained reception halls, storerooms, gardens, granaries, and servants' areas. Small houses clustered near wealthier ones. Proximity may reflect employment and dependency, rather than a modern neighborhood of equal citizens. Architecture shows hierarchy without explaining every relationship. Rubbish is among the most candid evidence. Broken pottery, ash, bone, seeds, failed objects, and manufacturing waste were not arranged to impress eternity. Their location can indicate cooking, craft, disposal, or later disturbance. A midden may contradict the abundant meals promised on a tomb wall. Household shrines complicate the idea that Akhenaten eliminated every god except Aten. Figures and amulets connected with Bes, Tauret, and other protective powers have been found in the city. Their presence does not prove open political resistance. People could participate in official institutions while maintaining domestic practices that address childbirth, illness, and danger. At Elephantine, an island near Egypt's southern frontier, archaeology and texts reveal successive fortifications, temples, houses, and multicultural communities. Much later, Aramaic papyri document a Jewish military community with its own temple in the 5th century BCE. That archive belongs to Persian period Egypt and cannot be projected into the age of the pyramids. It does show how varied Egyptian society could become. Crafting eternity. A finished coffin hides its workshop. Timber had to be acquired, cut, joined, plastered, painted, inscribed, transported, and paid for. Egypt had limited supplies of long, high-quality wood, so imported cedar and local woods were used. X-rays and close examination revealed dowels, reused boards, patches, and altered inscriptions beneath brilliant surfaces. Reuse was not always theft. A coffin might be inherited, sold, refurbished, reassigned after economic disruption, or taken from a burial in circumstances we cannot recover. Corrected names demonstrate a secondary owner, but not the transaction that placed the object in new hands. Moral certainty can exceed archaeological context. Faience, with its luminous blue-green surface, was made largely from crushed quartz with colorants and glaze-forming ingredients. It is not clay pottery and not natural turquoise. Craftspeople produced beads, tiles, vessels, amulets, and figurines through several techniques. Variations in composition and firing help laboratories investigate workshop traditions. Glass became more prominent in the New Kingdom. Colored glass could imitate precious stones and required controlled heat and skilled handling. Whether early raw glass was made locally or imported in particular cases remains a technical research question. Finished objects reveal both Egyptian innovation and international exchange. Stone choice carried practical and symbolic weight. Granite, limestone, sandstone, calcite, basalt, and harder ornamental stones differed in source and working behavior. Modern labels can be confusing. Egyptian alabaster usually refers to calcite, not the gypsum alabaster familiar elsewhere. Quarry provenance may be studied through mineral signatures, inscriptions, and transport routes. Gold could be hammered into thin sheet, cast, joined, inlaid, and combined with colored materials. The dazzling surfaces of royal objects depended on mining and labor far from the palace. Nubian gold entered networks enforced at times through Egyptian conquest. Beauty and extraction belong to the same history. Artists and craftspeople were not uniformly anonymous. Some signed or represented themselves, and Deir el-Medina preserves names across generations. Teams had ranks and divisions. Training occurred through copying, practice pieces, correction, and family connections. The modern category, artist, may separate design from manual labor more sharply than Egyptian titles did. Images could be transferred using grids and preliminary sketches. On ostraca, a practiced hand might capture an animal with a few assured lines or caricature, a social inversion in which mice command cats. Such drawings reveal humor and experimentation excluded from formal tomb programs. Canon did not eliminate imagination, it directed where different kinds of imagination could appear. Cloth, cleanliness, and status linen production began with flax cultivation and required pulling, retting, beating, spinning, and weaving. Cloth could wrap bodies, clothe the living, furnish rooms, serve temples, and circulate as wealth. Fine linen demanded extraordinary control. The labor condensed into a single folded sheet is easy to overlook beside gold. Most surviving elite images show clean white garments, but daily cloth stained, tore, and was mended. Laundry required water, labor, and alkaline cleaning materials. People wore sandals in some contexts and went barefoot in others. Wigs, shaved heads, cosmetics, jewelry, and scent communicated status, ritual condition, and personal care. Kohl around the eyes had aesthetic and protective associations. Chemical studies of cosmetic materials identify mineral ingredients and sometimes manufactured compounds. Claims that eyeliner functioned exactly like a modern antibiotic simplify concentration and use. A substance can have biological activity without ancient users understanding it through germ theory. Cones shown on the heads of banquet participants were long debated as symbolic blobs of perfume. Archaeological discoveries of actual cone-shaped material at Amarna strengthened the case that at least some were physical objects. Their composition and use remain under study. This is how a visual convention and excavation can correct one another without settling every detail. Social position affected access to all these goods. Titles, tomb size, diet, and possessions describe gradients rather than only king and peasant. Servants shown tiny beside an owner were not literally small. Scale made hierarchy visible. Enslaved and dependent people remain difficult to distinguish archaeologically because legal status does not fossilize. Texts documenting sale, capture, and compelled labor prevent comfortable assumptions. An estate's prosperity relied on many hands whose names were omitted from its owner's tomb. The polished image of abundance is therefore both evidence and concealment. It records tools, crops, and gestures while centering the person who commissioned the war. Reading downward toward the smaller figures changes the history we hear. Many Egypts along one river. Modern maps encourage a view from above, one green ribbon, one kingdom, one capital. Ancient travel made distance bodily. A message moved at the speed of boat, animal, or runner. Dialects, cults, crops, and political loyalties varied along the river and through the delta. The ideal of two lands joined under one king acknowledged a unity that had to be repeatedly performed. Egyptologists divide the country into nomes, administrative regions, whose number and boundaries changed. Each had local centers and sacred traditions. Provincial officials could represent royal authority while building family power. When central government weakened, those networks did not disappear. They became foundations for regional rule. The periods called intermediate were named from the standpoint of unified kingdoms before and after them. The label is useful chronologically but risks describing every decentralized decade as empty chaos. Provincial cemeteries and inscriptions show local ambition, art, exchange, conflict, and adaptation. The state fragmented. Life continued. After the Old Kingdom, autobiographical inscriptions praise officials for feeding their districts during hunger. Such claims may preserve responses to real hardship, but they are also moral self-presentations. A governor who says nobody starved because of him is campaigning for eternal reputation. Climate records suggest episodes of low Nile floods around the broader transition, while political succession, resources, and provincial power also mattered. One drought did not press a button labeled collapse. The Middle Kingdom emerged through conflict and reunification led from Thebes. Mentuhotep II's monument at Deir el-Bahari combined tomb, cult, landscape, and a newly powerful southern dynasty. Later 12th dynasty kings ruled from a residence whose exact archaeological location remains debated, illustrating how a politically central place can be textually visible and physically elusive. Middle Kingdom literature later became classical in scribal education. Texts may stage pessimism, loyalism, eloquence, or royal instruction. Dating a composition is difficult when surviving manuscripts are later school copies. The date of a papyrus is not automatically the date when its story was first created. Royal pyramids continued, now often with mud brick cores and elaborate security arrangements. Their damaged condition is sometimes treated as proof of inferior engineering. Material choice, later quarrying, groundwater, and time all shaped survival. A ruin cannot be ranked simply by how photogenic it remains. The delta's missing landscapes. The Nile Delta held cities, ports, farms, marshes, temples, and royal residences, yet wet soils and dense later settlement have erased or buried much. Stone was transported away. Mud brick dissolved back into earth. Archaeology there often relies on coring, geophysics, rescue excavation, pottery scatters, and blocks found reused far from their original walls. Avaris, at Tel el-Dabba, became the capital associated with the Hyksos rulers of the Second Intermediate Period. Excavation reveals a cosmopolitan settlement with connections to the Levant, distinctive burials, architecture, and material culture. The word Hyksos derives from an Egyptian term for rulers of foreign lands. It was not the ancient name of one invading race. Later Egyptian traditions portrayed these rulers negatively, and much modern storytelling turned them into a sudden barbarian horde. The archaeological picture supports migration, settlement, cultural mixture, and eventual political control developing over time. Violence accompanied the struggle in which Theban kings expelled Hyksos power, but the population history was more complex than invasion followed by disappearance. New kingdom rulers built at Ramses in the eastern delta, near the earlier region of Avaris. When river branches shifted, royal activity moved and monuments were transported to Tanis. Early excavators encountering Ramesside statues at Tanis sometimes thought they had found Ramesses itself. Geological and archaeological work corrected the identification. Even colossal stone can migrate. The biblical story of Israel in Egypt has inspired attempts to match texts and sites directly. The name Ramesses in Exodus and the city Pi-Ramses create an apparent connection, but archaeology has not verified the biblical narrative as a mass departure described in the text. Egyptian records do mention a people called Israel on the victory stela of Merneptah in Canaan near the end of the 13th century BCE. That inscription is important evidence for a named group, not proof of every preceding episode. Historical caution here is not hostility to religious meaning. A sacred narrative can shape communities without functioning as a modern administrative report. Archaeology asks what material patterns a proposed event should leave and whether they appear. Silence in royal inscriptions alone proves little, since kings omitted defeats. The combined chronological, settlement, and textual evidence is what matters. Flood, famine, and climate. Clues, nilometers recorded river height at particular places and periods. Later measurements cannot be assumed for the Old Kingdom, and a high reading in one location does not translate mechanically into harvest everywhere. Flood timing, basin maintenance, seed, pests, labor, and storage affected outcomes. Scientists investigate ancient climate through lake sediments, cave deposits, pollen, dust, river deposits, tree rings from imported timber, and other proxies. Each archive covers a region and carries dating uncertainty. Converging proxies can identify broad trends, but they rarely narrate the political consequences on their own. The famine stela on Sail Island tells of 7 years of low Nile under Giza, and a grant associated with the god Komnum. It was carved in the Ptolemaic period, more than 2 millennia after Giza. It may preserve traditions, but it is not an Old Kingdom eyewitness inscription. Its later temple and political setting must guide interpretation. The biblical 7-year famine of Joseph, Giza's tale, and Mesopotamian motifs are sometimes merged into one event. Similar numbers and themes do not establish identity. 7 carried literary significance, and famine stories could validate wise rulers, gods, institutions, or administrators. Correlation requires chronology and independent links, not resemblance alone. Storage reduced risk, but also concentrated power. Granaries shown in models and paintings had administrative oversight. Grain could feed dependents, pay workers, support temples, and survive between harvests. It could also be taxed and withheld. Insects, moisture, theft, and accounting losses complicated the ideal of secure abundance. During episodes of disruption, households adapted through exchange, migration, substitution, and appeals to patrons or temples. Archaeology sees these strategies imperfectly. A change in animal bones or pottery may indicate altered supply, taste, population, or excavation sample. Resilience is difficult to prove as collapse, but it keeps inquiry focused on people acting within pressure. Regional history makes the long continuity of Egypt less mysterious. No institution survived unchanged for 3,000 years. Authority contracted and expanded. Centers shifted. Newcomers entered. Traditions were copied, edited, and claimed. What endured was not a frozen blueprint, but a repertoire capable of being rebuilt. The cost of an afterlife burial was also an economy. Stone cutters, embalmers, carpenters, painters, linen producers, potters, gardeners, linen producers, potters, mourners, priests, transport workers, and scribes could. A wealthy household purchased more labor and material, while poorer families adapted available forms. Belief was not measured only in gold. Access was nevertheless unequal. Most people were not buried in decorated rock-cut tombs. Simple pits, reused chambers, communal spaces, modest coffins, mats, jars, and a small number of personal objects appear across periods. Bodies could be disturbed when cemeteries expanded or later burials entered older ground. The absence of rich equipment cannot tell us that a family lacked grief or hope. Elite tomb chapels created places where the living presented food, spoke names, and maintained relations with the dead. Letters to deceased relatives ask for help with illness, inheritance, or household trouble, and sometimes accuse a spirit of causing distress. These texts show that death did not end social obligation. They do not prove that the dead answered in a way a modern experiment could verify. Offering formulas compressed an ideal supply of bread, beer, cattle, birds, linen, incense, and every good thing. An image or written list could function when physical offerings ceased. This principle made representation effective, but actual cults also required land, personnel, and descendants. Endowments fragmented, institutions failed, and chapels were reused. Eternity depended on maintenance. Coffin design altered profoundly. Old Kingdom elites might use relatively plain rectangular boxes. Middle Kingdom coffins carried eyes, offering texts, object friezes, and interior maps. Later, anthropoid coffins wrapped the deceased in a human-shaped sacred image. Styles overlapped and varied regionally. A coffin's appearance is a dating tool, not an infallible calendar. Canopic treatment changed as well. Organs could be wrapped, placed in jars, returned to the body, or accompanied by jars that were symbolic rather than functional. The four sons of Horus became associated with protected organs, but the familiar mapping belongs to developed traditions and should not be imposed on every early burial. Even when jars remained, later examples might be solid dummy vessels. Shabti figures began as representations connected with the deceased and developed into workers expected to answer for labor in the next world. Some burials contained one. Wealthy later assemblages could include hundreds, organized with overseers. Their spell imagines agricultural obligation continuing after death. The ideal afterlife was not simply endless leisure. It was a society whose burdens magic redirected. The small figures are often called servants, but they should not be confused automatically with portraits of real enslaved people. They are magical substitutes. Their mass production does, however, reveal workshop organization and differences in purchasing power. A roughly molded faience example and a finely inscribed stone figure participated in the same broad idea at very different cost. Heart scarabs carried a spell asking the heart not to testify against its owner in judgment. The request exposes tension within the celebrated weighing scene. The heart knew the person from inside. Some scarabs were placed over the chest, though fine context matters, because objects could shift as wrappings decayed or robbers searched a body. Tomb robbery was destructive and also systematic material recovery. Gold could be stripped, coffins sold, linen removed, and wood repurposed. In periods of instability, officials and priests may have participated in opening burials. Calling every reused object mere recycling softens violation. Imagining only desperate outsiders ignores organized markets and institutional access. Early European collectors sometimes purchased mummies as curiosities, unwrapped them before audiences, ground alleged mummy material for medicine or pigment, and exported bodies with little documentation. Not every familiar tale about Mummy Brown can be confirmed for every product, but the commodification was real. Scientific interest operated inside collecting cultures that frequently denied ancient people dignity. Museums now debate display, sampling, storage, and repatriation of human remains. CT imaging can reduce invasive examination, yet scanning a body and broadcasting its interior are not ethically neutral. Researchers consider consent impossible to obtain, descendant or source community interests, religious context, and public benefit. Standards differ among institutions and countries. The word mummy itself can make a person into a category of object, where names survive. Using them restores something of individuality. Where they do not, age and sex estimates are probability statements, not biographies. A skeleton identified as probably female and middle-aged has not told us her occupation, favorite song, or private faith. Ancient embalmers sometimes left tools, packing, or unexpected objects within bodies. Modern headlines describe these as shocking mistakes. Some may be accidents, others part of repair or ritual, and some apparent anomalies result from later disturbance. Respectful uncertainty resists turning a dead person into a puzzle box. The study of burial therefore joins two responsibilities. Material evidence can illuminate disease, diet, kinship, craft, and belief. At the same time, the evidence consists of people who were deliberately laid to rest. Curiosity gains authority when it accepts limits, documents every intervention, and remembers that knowledge is not the only value preserved in a tomb. A language across millennia. Ancient Egyptian was not one unchanged language. Scholars distinguish Old, Middle, and Late Egyptian, followed by Demotic and Coptic stages. While spoken change did not wait politely for textbook boundaries. Middle Egyptian retained prestige in monumental and literary use after everyday grammar had moved on. A New Kingdom scribe could therefore write in a classical register, as someone today might use ceremonial language unlike ordinary conversation. Hieroglyphic signs usually omitted most vowels, so many familiar pronunciations are scholarly conventions. The name written as Ramesses preserves consonantal information and royal wordplay, but no recording tells us exactly how every courtier pronounced it. Egyptologists insert vowels to make words speakable and use evidence from Coptic, foreign transcriptions, and linguistic comparison. A reconstructed pronunciation should not be advertised as certainty. The phrase "Book of the Dead" is likewise modern. Its Egyptian title is often translated as "coming forth by day." Translation choices can make the text sound more unified, gloomy, or exotic than its manuscripts are. A translator must decide where a damaged sign stood, which dictionary sense fits, and how much unfamiliar grammar to smooth. Two responsible translations may differ without one concealing a secret. Scribble education left exercises on ostraca and wooden boards. Students copied signs, vocabulary, model letters, wisdom instructions, and literary passages. Corrections expose learning in motion. Some hands are hesitant, others repeat a line until space runs out. The evidence does not define one national curriculum, and training probably occurred in households and offices as well as institutions later called schools. The satirical composition praising the scribal profession lists other occupations as filthy, painful, or exhausting. It is entertaining but not a neutral labor survey. Students learn to value the identity they hoped to enter. A farmer mocked by a scribe remained necessary to feed the scribe. Wisdom texts advise self-control, listening, proper speech, generosity, and restraint before superiors. They are sometimes presented as universal Egyptian morality. In fact, manuscripts belong to different periods and social settings. Advice on navigating a superior's table says much about hierarchy. The ideal silent man was not merely shy. Disciplined speech could signify mastery and safety. Satire and obscenity survived too. Pictures show animals behaving like humans, social roles reversed, and erotic scenes far removed from stiff museum stereotypes. The Turin erotic papyrus combines explicit imagery with exaggerated male figures whose meaning remains debated. Calling it either straightforward pornography or a sacred manual settles a question the context does not securely answer. Legal and administrative Egyptian could be dense with formula. A contract's repeated clauses are valuable precisely because small deviations matter. Demotic documents record loans, marriage arrangements, leases, sales, temple affairs, and petitions. They restore late Egyptian society from beneath a historical narrative once dominated by Greek and Roman authors. Multilingual Egypt created translation at every level. The Rosetta Decree used 2 languages and 3 scripts, Egyptian in hieroglyphic and demotic forms, and Greek. The versions correspond closely but are not mechanically identical in every phrase. Each addressed conventions and audiences. Decipherment relied on relation, not on a perfect word-for-word code. Champollion's breakthrough also depended on Coptic, the latest stage of Egyptian, written mainly with Greek letters and additional signs. This continuity defeats the romantic claim that ancient Egypt was utterly mute until Europe rescued it. Egyptian Christians had preserved the language and liturgy in manuscripts, even though the older scripts were unread. Decipherment itself had predecessors and collaborators beyond the simplified rivalry of Young and Champollion. Medieval Arabic-speaking scholars examined hieroglyphs and sometimes recognized that signs could have phonetic value. European savants compiled copies, often inaccurate. Travelers, draftsmen, and Egyptian laborers enabled access. Intellectual history becomes more truthful when it widens the frame. Once texts could be read, they did not reveal one hidden doctrine. They revealed text deliveries, hymns, insults, land disputes, laundry lists, royal boasts, recipes, prayers, and school mistakes. The great secret of hieroglyphs was that they wrote a human language capable of grandeur and routine. Lost libraries and surviving scraps, popular imagination fills temple chambers with complete libraries of advanced science. Temples did maintain collections of ritual, medical, astronomical, geographic, and administrative knowledge. A title translated as House of Life is associated with scribal and learned activity, though its organization varied and remains incompletely understood. Papyrus was valuable and could be reused. A sheet might carry writing on both sides. Old documents could become cartonnage in coffins or mummy masks. Modern separation of cartonnage can recover texts while destroying the artifact that preserved them. Imaging technologies increasingly seek to read layers non-destructively, but results depend on ink composition and material thickness. At sites such as Oxyrhynchus, later rubbish deposits preserved enormous quantities of papyri, chiefly from Greek and Roman Egypt. They include literary works, tax records, private letters, and mundane accounts. Their survival is spectacular but regionally and chronologically specific. They cannot stand for all earlier Egyptian archives. Ostraka endured where papyrus vanished. A limestone flake could carry a sketch on one side and an account on the other. Archaeologists once privileged formal texts and discarded humble fragments more readily. Modern study recognizes that informal writing maps literacy, work, prices, networks, and emotion. Even a royal archive is partial. The Amarna tablets were left because the capital was abandoned. What officials carried away is unknown. Some senders appear repeatedly, others only once. Absence from the archive can mean political silence, missing excavation, perished material, or a different communication route. No credible evidence supports a concealed pharaonic library beneath the Great Sphinx. The Hall of Records story grew from modern occult and psychic traditions, not Egyptian inscriptions or excavation. Cavities and geological features near a monument do not acquire books because a prophecy assigned them a purpose. The loss of texts remains enormous without imagined chambers. Fire, moisture, insects, reuse, neglect, and ordinary disposal. Erased voices, what survives often did so accidentally. History is built from scraps, and its gaps should inspire conservation rather than the confident invention of what a perfect library would have said. Value. Before coins for most pharaonic history, Egyptians exchanged goods and recorded value without minted coinage. Grain, metal by weight, cloth, oil, and other commodities could serve as payment or standards of account. This was not a primitive world limited to direct barter. A price could be expressed in a unit of copper value, even when buyer and seller settled with several different goods. The deben was a unit of weight whose material and magnitude varied by period. New Kingdom records from Deir el-Medina. Price objects in copper deben and subdivisions. A coffin, animal, tool, or basket could be compared through this accounting language. Translating such prices into modern currency is rarely meaningful because wages, scarcity, household production, and state rations belong to another economy. Workers at Deir el-Medina received grain rations as a principal part of compensation, with other supplies delivered at intervals. They also produced objects privately, exchanged goods, lent commodities, and accumulated property. Their unusually rich records should not be treated as a complete portrait of every Egyptian village. These were skilled state workers with a special institutional setting. Markets are less visible than temples because a market stall left little monumental architecture. Tomb scenes, texts, weights, containers, and settlement spaces indicate exchange. Women and men could participate. Haggling, credit, kinship, and reputation likely shaped transactions, but surviving pictures may arrange traders into a legible artistic scene rather than record one market day. Standard weights supported trust, while fraudulent measures remain possible. Wisdom texts and religious declarations condemn altering the balance. The image of scales linked ordinary exchange with cosmic justice and the weighing of the heart. A reliable measure was both practical and moral. Debt could bind households. Loans of grain might carry substantial interest, especially across an agricultural cycle. Documents record pledges, guarantors, deadlines, and disputes. The exact legal consequences changed through time. Translating every dependency as slavery, or every contract as free choice, misses the pressures between those poles. Redistribution moved goods through palace, temple, estate, and military institutions. Farmers delivered dues, storerooms issued rations, expeditions received supplies. Yet not every loaf passed through a central warehouse. Household production and local exchange remain fundamental. Command economy captures institutional reach, but can imply a total control the evidence does not sustain. Transport gave value to geography. Heavy cargo moved efficiently by boat when channels permitted. Donkeys carried loads overland. People carried countless smaller burdens. Wheeled carts were useful in some contexts, but soft fields, narrow paths, and the river favored other methods. A monument stone represents not only quarrying but scheduling water, crews, ropes, food, and unloading. The Nile flood altered routes. Harbors and canals brought boats nearer construction and cultivation zones. At Giza, sediment and landscape studies helped reconstruct waterways no longer visible. Statements that workers floated blocks directly to the pyramid's base should remain sensitive to changing shoreline, harbor basins, and the difference between broad access and one proven route for every stone. Egypt imported cedar from the Levant, silver from Western Asia and the Mediterranean world, incense from southern routes, and lapis lazuli through long-distance networks, ultimately reaching Afghanistan. These materials could change hands many times. Finding lapis in Egypt does not prove an Egyptian expedition visited its geological source. Exports and diplomatic gifts included grain, gold, linen, crafted vessels, and prestige objects. Egyptian-style items abroad may represent trade, gift, local imitation, migrant craftspeople, or later movement. Archaeologists examine manufacture and context rather than assigning every scarab to an Egyptian traveler. Shipwrecks reveal exchange in transit. The late Bronze Age wreck at Uluburun, off the coast of modern Turkey, carried copper and tin ingots, glass, ivory, resin, jewelry, and objects tied to several regions, including Egypt. Its cargo embodies a connected Eastern Mediterranean. It was not an Egyptian ship simply because an Egyptian object was aboard. The vessel's identity and route are separate questions. Economic stress appears in ration delays, theft accusations, reduced tomb investment, hoarding, and administrative correspondence. Inflation-like changes in commodity prices can be traced in some later records, although ancient price series are incomplete. Political stability did not guarantee an equal distribution of security. The wealth buried with a king was withdrawn only temporarily from circulation. Robbers returned much of its metal and wood to markets, while priests reused valuable equipment. This observation explains behavior. It does not excuse violation. Funerary accumulation and tomb robbery were connected parts of an economy, in which durable materials never stopped attracting claims. Coins entered widespread Egyptian use under later foreign dynasties, especially the Ptolemies, bringing new taxation and monetized exchange while payments in kind continued. Currency did not erase grain accounting overnight. Economic systems overlap, and a coin found in an older sacred site may belong to centuries of later visitors rather than its original construction. The ordinary economy is difficult to dramatize because its successors left no single golden mask. A repaired jar, an accurately weighed bundle, a boat arriving before grain spoiled, or a loan repaid after harvest rarely became royal history. Yet those repeated acts sustained every expedition and temple. Monumental power rested on transactions, small enough to fit in a scribe's line. Excavating the excavators. People explored ancient remains long before archaeology became a profession. Egyptians entered, restored, quarried, and studied monuments already old to them. Prince Hatshepsut, a son of Ramesses II, is often called the first Egyptologist because inscriptions associate him with restoration of earlier monuments. The title is affectionate but anachronistic. His work served royal cult and memory, not a modern research discipline. Greek and Roman visitors wrote descriptions and carved graffiti. Medieval Arabic authors investigated pyramids, scripts, technology, and treasure stories with varying care. European travel accounts later mixed observation with biblical interpretation and classical expectation. Each visitor arrived with questions inherited from a particular world. Napoleon's expedition brought soldiers and savants. The immense description de l'Egypte recorded landscapes, antiquities, plants, animals, and contemporary life, while French occupation brought violence and imperial ambition. Scholarship and conquest were not separate stories. The Rosetta Stone's transfer to Britain after French defeat demonstrates how military outcomes redirected cultural property. In the 19th century, demand from museums and collectors encouraged rapid clearing and destructive extraction. Giovanni Belzoni used ingenuity and physical force to move colossal objects and enter monuments. His achievements in access and transport were celebrated, but his methods sacrificed context by modern standards. Judging the history of archaeology requires acknowledging both records created and evidence destroyed. Auguste Mariette's discovery of the Sadapium and his role in establishing an Egyptian antiquities service changed institutional control. Gaston Maspero expanded documentation and regulation. These systems still operated within colonial power and often privileged foreign institutions. National archaeology emerged through conflict over who excavated, kept finds, and interpreted Egypt. Flinders. Petrie promoted systematic recording. Pottery sequence dating, and attention to small finds. His methods helped transform field archaeology. He also held eugenic and racial ideas now recognized as damaging, and his labor practices belonged to colonial hierarchy. Methodological contribution does not require moral sainthood. Neither should criticism erase what a method changed. Egyptian workers possessed excavation skill, local geography, and artifact knowledge. Foremen such as Ali Sufi became essential to major projects, though publications frequently centered the foreign director. Families from Cuna and other communities carried expertise across generations. Recovering their names changes discovery from a lone genius story into collective labor. Egyptian archaeologists increasingly led the field. Ahmed Kamal worked as a pioneering curator and scholar and trained Egyptian students. Salim Hassan directed major Giza excavations and published extensively. Sami Gabra excavated at sites including Tuna el-Gebel. Labib Habachi transformed study of monuments and historical geography. Their careers resist any narrative in which Egyptology is knowledge produced only outside Egypt. Excavation methods now emphasize grids, stratigraphy, samples, digital coordinates, photography, conservation, and publication. A project may include ceramicists, archaeobotanists, zooarchaeobotanists, zooarchaeologists, geologists, osteologists, architects, epigraphers, conservators, and community specialists. This breadth slows the heroic moment of discovery and greatly enlarges what's the Chicago method of epigraphy, developed for recording complex temple surfaces, combines photography, drawing, collation, and repeated checking at the wall. A published plate is an interpretation disciplined by team verification. It can record damage and corrections with clarity a photograph alone may not provide. No copy completely replaces the monument. Conservation begins before an object leaves soil. Salt can crystallize. Wood can shrink. Pigment can detach. Wet material can collapse as it dries. Opening a tomb changes temperature, humidity, light, and airflow. Tourism brings resources and public value, while breath, dust, touch, and crowding add stress. Site management is an ongoing experiment, not a completed rescue. The relocation of Abu Simbel and other monuments during construction of the Aswan High Dam demonstrated extraordinary international engineering and cooperation. Temples were cut into blocks and rebuilt above the rising water. At the same time, Nubian communities were displaced, and numerous archaeological landscapes were submerged. Celebrating the rescue of stone should not silence the human cost of the development project. Looting is not only the removal of attractive objects. Digging through layers breaks associations that could establish date, function, and ownership. A dealer may invent provenance to make an object marketable. Scholars therefore scrutinize collection history. Export documentation, collection history, export documentation, inscriptions and tool marks. Forgery can imitate style while failing in language or manufacture. Scientific testing may identify modern pigment, impossible alloy, recent tool traces, or suspicious organic material. Yet a technically old material can be reused by a modern forger, and an unusual genuine object may violate expectations. Authentication is an argument assembled from several independent observations. Publication is part of excavation, not an optional epilogue. Material left in storerooms without accessible records cannot fully enter scholarship. Revisiting old excavation notebooks and museum boxes often produces discoveries without a new trench. A label corrected after a century can restore an object to its building or owner. Digital databases now reunite scattered photographs, plans, squeezes, diaries, and objects virtually. They improve access while reflecting catalog choices and unequal digitization. A search result is not the whole archive. Spellings vary. Early labels can be wrong. And objects without glamorous photographs remain harder to find. The future of Egyptology will depend as much on conservation and collaboration as spectacular finds. Expanding cities, groundwater, agriculture, climate change, and tourism threaten sites. Egyptian authorities make decisions among urgent needs with finite resources. Foreign missions work by permission and partnership, not entitlement. The phrase, "discovered by," should therefore make us pause. Was a monument unknown or known locally but newly reported to a European institution? Who led the excavation? Who first saw the object? Who read the inscription? Stabilized the wood, carried baskets, funded the season, and published the context? Discovery is usually a chain whose most famous link is not the only one. Women around the throne, Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, dominate modern accounts because each ruled in her own right. But queenship had many forms. Royal wives, mothers, daughters and sisters linked dynasties, held estates, served cults, appeared in diplomacy, and helped frame succession. Their power depended on period and individual circumstance rather than one permanent office. Meneth of the First Dynasty received a monumental burial at Abydos and appears in seal evidence connected with kingship. Whether she should be numbered as a reigning king or understood as a regent remains debated. The uncertainty arises from early evidence, not from an assumption that a woman could not rule. Sobekneferu at the end of the 12th dynasty used full royal titulary and is securely recognized as a female king. Her reign was brief and the succession after her unstable, encouraging stories that her rule caused collapse. Sequence is not causation. Dynastic weakness preceded her accession, and surviving evidence is too limited for a personal failure narrative. The title God's Wife of Amun changed across the New Kingdom in later periods. Some holders exercised substantial religious and economic authority, especially in the Third Intermediate and late periods, when office holders at Thebes could adopt successors and control estates. Translating the title literally without tracing its institutional history hides that transformation. Royal mothers could legitimize young kings. Images of divine birth present a god engendering the ruler and deities attending birth. Hatshepsut's cycle is famous, but related imagery was not a private confession about biological paternity. It stated sacred legitimacy through temple language. Amenhotep III's wife Tai appeared prominently in sculpture and inscriptions, and participated in international correspondence. The Amarna letters show foreign rulers addressing or remembering her political knowledge after her husband's death. This is stronger evidence for influence than claims based only on the size of a statue. Nefertiti's later career remains one of Amarna's genuine puzzles. Her images and titles increased, and some scholars connect her with a female ruler or courtier known under debated names. Fragmentary inscriptions allow competing reconstructions. The beautiful painted bust from Amarna proves her importance in royal representation. It does not settle the sequence after Akhenaten. Nefertari, principal wife of Ramesses II, received a richly decorated tomb and a temple at Abu Simbel. Diplomatic letters include communication with the Hittite queen. Her prominence should not be converted into evidence that she secretly ruled the empire. Public honor and political participation do not require a hidden throne. Marriage among non-royal Egyptians was usually established socially rather than through a surviving universal wedding ceremony. Documents focused on property, support, inheritance, and the consequences of separation. The modern phrase marriage contract can cover texts with different legal purposes. Affectionate terms and letters coexist with practical negotiation. Women could bring property into a household and retain claims. Divorce occurred, and settlements might protect a wife or children. Legal capacity did not prevent pressure, violence, abandonment, or unequal household labor. The documentary visibility of a right is not proof that every person could exercise it safely. Sibling language causes additional confusion. Words translated as brother and sister could be terms of affection between spouses, and royal families sometimes practiced close-kin marriage. The frequency and motive varied. Ptolemaic sibling marriage had dynastic and ideological dimensions and cannot be projected unchanged into every village or early dynasty. Genetic studies of royal mummies have been used to reconstruct close kinship, especially around Tutankhamun. Degraded ancient DNA presents contamination and replication challenges, and proposed family trees depend on which bodies are correctly identified. Kinship probability is not the same as a name. Childbirth tied family survival to danger. Maternal mortality is difficult to quantify because causes are rarely preserved clearly, but obstructed birth, bleeding, and infection were real risks. Magical protection did not replace practical assistance. Both belong to care. Midwives are plausible and appear in later and comparative evidence, though the institutional details of pharaonic practice remain elusive. Children were named, nursed, carried, taught, disciplined, and mourned. High childhood mortality shaped households. Yet parents did not regard children as emotionally disposable. Carefully wrapped infant burials, letters, and family imagery testify to attachment. Population statistics should never be mistaken for private indifference. Royal succession was not governed by a surviving simple rule that the eldest son always inherited. Kings had multiple wives and children. Sons died, factions formed, coadjuvancies may have been arranged. Later inscriptions could rewrite a contested accession as divine selection. The mystery of a succession is often political because successful rulers made alternatives difficult to see. Women's history advances when evidence is neither minimized nor inflated. A female title need not conceal a matriarchy, and male-dominated office-holding does not make women absent. Contracts, letters, burials, textiles, shrines, and royal monuments preserve different portions of authority. No single celebrated queen can stand for them all. Who entered the king lists? Egyptian king lists were ritual selections, not complete modern chronologies. Lists at Abydos and elsewhere placed a reigning king within an approved succession of predecessors. Some rulers were omitted because their memory was politically awkward, their legitimacy rejected, or the list served a particular cultic design. An omission is evidence of selection, not proof that the person never existed. The Taran king list, written on papyrus and now fragmentary, preserves rulers absent from monumental sequences and assigns lengths to reigns. Its broken pieces have been painstakingly arranged, and proposed placements can change. A number reconstructed across a damaged fiber should not be narrated with the confidence of an intact date. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek under the early Ptolemies, organized rulers into dynasties. His original work is lost and survives through quotations and summaries by later authors. Egyptologists still use his dynastic framework because it is practical, while correcting it with inscriptions and archaeology. A familiar system can be both indispensable and imperfect. Regnal years restarted when a new king acceded. Dating an event, therefore, requires identifying the ruler, reading the year, and placing that reign in sequence. Co-regencies, rival kings, damaged names, and regional rule complicate conversion into BCE dates. Chronology is a network of synchronisms rather than one master calendar discovered whole. Scarabs bearing royal names traveled, were collected, copied, and remained in use. A scarab of an old kingdom king found in a later layer does not automatically date that layer to his reign. Archaeologists distinguish an object's manufacture from its deposition. Heirlooms and antiques existed in antiquity too. Egyptians looked backward with curiosity. New Kingdom scribes visited older monuments and left appreciative graffiti. Later builders copied archaic poses or language to claim venerable authority. The late period's interest in early forms is sometimes called archaism, but it was creative selection, not cultural exhaustion. The word decline can conceal this invention. Political territory contracted. Taxation faltered, or foreign armies won. Yet artists, priests, families, and merchants continued adapting. A state can lose an empire without its culture becoming empty. Late Egyptian temples contain some of the richest surviving religious inscriptions, precisely because learned traditions continued. Persian kings ruled Egypt in two major periods and met both cooperation and revolt. Greek sources often frame the relationship through hostility. Egyptian evidence shows royal titulary and temple engagement as well as resistance. Foreign occupation names, a political fact, but not every local response. Alexander's conquest replaced Persian authority, and his successors built a Macedonian dynasty. Alexandria became a Mediterranean capital, with Greek institutions, Egyptian temples, Jewish communities, traders, scholars, soldiers, and enslaved people. The famous library belonged to this urban and royal world. Its losses occurred over time. No single universally accepted fire erased all ancient knowledge in one night. The Library of Alexandria did not contain technological blueprints from a super civilization. It did embody ambitious collecting, scholarship, cataloging, and royal prestige. Texts were copied, edited, argued over, and dispersed. Libraries are practices and people as well as buildings, so their history cannot be reduced to flames. Under Rome, Egypt's grain and revenue mattered greatly. Emperors could be represented in traditional temple scenes, although most never performed those rituals in person. Local priests maintained the visual fiction of present kingship. The image's ritual efficacy did not require political independence. Christianization was gradual and contested. Temples closed at different times. Sacred spaces were reused. Monks inhabited desert sites. Coptic writers preserved and transformed Egyptian language. Damage to divine images can reflect religious conflict, but quarrying, treasure-seeking, and natural loss all operated. Each wall needs its own history. Arabic became dominant after the 7th century conquest, while Coptic continued in community and church. Medieval Egyptians lived among monuments and generated explanations for them. Some protected or studied antiquities. Others quarried them. The idea that Egypt slept unaware until a European awakening is itself a colonial myth. Modern national memory has continued to change. Pharaonic imagery entered museums, schoolbooks, architecture, tourism, cinema, and political symbolism. Excavations provide employment and disruption. Heritage sites are homes, sacred places, economic resources, and research landscapes at once. No expert interpretation owns all those meanings. Why the ending is not an ending. Histories often stop with Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE because pharaonic political independence ended. Egyptian temples, language, craft, and religious practice continued. Other narratives stop with the last hieroglyph or the closure of temples. Such dates mark transformations, not the disappearance of inhabitants. Period labels help organize an immense span, but every boundary cuts through lives. A potter working when one dynasty replaced another did not wake inside a textbook chapter. Fields still needed seed, children still learned names, and officials altered the authority written at the top of documents. The civilization's longevity was not the mystery of an unchanged race or secret doctrine. It arose from geography, institutions, agricultural knowledge, coercion, memory, adaptation, and countless local decisions. The same factors sometimes failed. There was no spell protecting the state from succession crises, low floods, invasion, debt, or ambitious rivals. What feels timeless at Giza is a surviving fraction. Casing stone was removed, temples vanished, settlements lie buried, and river channels moved. The pyramid endured partly because dismantling its core was difficult. Survival is not identical with original perfection, nor is survival neutral. Museum galleries selected durable and beautiful things. Digital media selects striking faces. Tourism selects accessible sites. A complete history must repeatedly return to mud brick, broken pottery, botanical samples, accounts, and human remains, because quieter evidence corrects the spectacle. When a new announcement promises to rewrite everything, 3 questions slow the pulse. Has the find been documented in context? Have specialists had access to data? Does the conclusion follow from the measurement? A genuine discovery usually adds relationships before it overturns civilizations. Egypt changes because research changes. Radiocarbon ranges are refined. Old photographs reveal vanished paint. A demotic contract receives a better reading. Residue alters a vessel's interpretation. Egyptian-led excavation recovers a neighborhood rather than treasure. Revision is not proof that scholars know nothing. It is how reliable knowledge becomes less wrong. Mystery remains in individual lives. We can price a coffin and not know who stood beside it. We can identify a meal and not hear its conversation. We can map a campaign without recovering a soldier's fear. Evidence brings the past close, then shows the final distance. That distance deserves patience. Ancient Egyptians were neither supernatural guardians nor modern people in costume. They inhabited moral, political, and sacred worlds partly accessible through their words and things. When our categories fail, the answer is careful translation, not fantasy. The river continues north as it always appears to have done, though dams now regulate the flood and cities cover ancient ground. At sunrise, temple axes and pyramid edges catch light that no builder could reserve for one age. Their work has entered other histories. The most durable tribute is not astonishment alone. It is accuracy joined with humility, giving named people their agency, unnamed workers their place, damaged evidence its limits, and unanswered questions their silence. In that silence, Egypt is not empty. It is waiting to be approached without the demand that every door conceal a miracle. Long after the last offering table fell quiet, the record still rewards that approach. A footprint does not need to identify its maker to prove a person crossed wet plaster. A corrected sign preserves a moment of judgment. A ration entry returns appetite and obligation to monumental history. None is a final answer. Together they replace a fantasy of impossible perfection with something deeper, an achievement made by fallible people, revised across generations, and preserved by chance as well as intention. The night ends there, beside evidence humble enough to be trusted and mysteries honest enough to remain open.